Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this live stream. In this chatter, I'd like to talk about how the dividing line between fantasy and reality is almost being lost. There were times in the past where even in times of great conflict or apocalyptic events, that reality was fairly clear, as was fantasy. Now, today we're seeing something that we probably haven't seen before in history, or at least not that I'm aware of. Fantasy is now being directly imposed on the reality. Now, let me give you an example of what I mean. Say in Black History Month, which is meant to be a celebration of Black achievement and so on, the narrative being pushed is one where Black people invented close to everything. And there's narratives in, say, Britain at the moment where Charles Darwin, the guy who developed the origin of the species, where natural selection of species and so on, it was a tour de force and a seminal work of its age. That's now being spun that some illiterate Black taxidermist was in fact the real engine behind all this, and he was the one that knew what was going on. And Charles Darwin was just some sort of flunky who was hanging off the genius coattails of this illiterate Black guy who knew nothing, and all he knew was how to stuff dead birds. But these stories are increasingly becoming a fantasy that's being imposed on a reality, and where we're being required now to believe it. So there's the issue of Charles Darwin. There's issues of Black women who are supposed to have invented the cure for cancer. The list just goes on and on of what these Black achieved. Did you know that Black people invented the light bulb? Edison, all these guys. No, they didn't do squat. And increasingly, we're being asked to believe that Britain, for example, was really close to 50% Black, going back hundreds of years, and now they're taking stories from Charles Dickens and so on, and casting Black people or brown people in the lead roles, and in English. British stories from going back to the 5th century and earlier, they're casting brown people in the lead roles, and it's of course utterly absurd. But we're being asked to believe that this fantasy that's being created is the reality, and that's the difference today. The people that are demanding that we see it as a reality, they know it's not true. They know it's a fantasy, but they demand that we accept it nonetheless, that the white population accepts it nonetheless. And for the Black and brown people, they get a kind of a free ride on it all. So I guess they don't care one way or another. Most of them in the West only for the free stuff anyway. So it doesn't really affect them. If it makes it easier for them to get free stuff, then hey, it's not a bad thing as they would see it. But it's humiliating and degrading for white people to know that their history is being rewritten and turned into an absurd fantasy. Now, fantasy has existed in certain ways. For example, the superhero comic strip characters, Superman, Batman, and there's a Green Lantern. Just goes on and on the list. And we saw Captain America. We all knew that they were fantasy characters. And you look at the 1960s TV series of Batman, it was very camp anyway, but again, clearly it was a fantasy. People knew that it was a fantasy. So in the 1920s and 30s, probably during the Depression era, I guess, when when things weren't so good, a lot of particularly Jewish people invented these superheroes, people that would right the wrongs that it was perceived governments and so on weren't doing or weren't doing enough of. And this was pre the Nazi era, or during the very early days of the Nazi era. So the motivation was more the depression rather than the Nazism at the time. But this idea of superheroes, so creating these fantasy worlds where the bad guys got what was coming to them, where Superman with truth and justice, his X-ray vision, his heat ray vision eyes, and all sorts of things would beat the crap out of the bad guys if they stepped out of line, and this was the fantasy world that was created. So we could imagine a world where good people were okay and the bad guys got their comeuppance. But life's never quite that simple. But the fantasy was quite clear that these crazy sci-fi novels, the novels came in later on, like Isaac Asimov and all this sort of thing. These sci-fi novels, the characters, the creation of, say, the Star Trek genre. Again, Jews were very prominent in creating these things, imagining a future communist world where everybody was equal and everyone was equally intelligent and equally bright and was equally taking responsibility and all this sort of thing. So that was of course a fantasy world, but we knew the dividing line between fantasy and reality, and this I believe has been lost. We're now in a situation where fantasy is vigorously and energetically and brutally, even at the point of a gun, is being pushed on the white Western population, and it's being demanded that they not only accept it, believe it, and agree, but never disagree with it. So the crazy transgender nonsense going around as but one example. You put up a mean tweet about a transgender person, and the police will bypass the multiple murders, the muggings, the stabbings. They'll drive and walk past all of those to get to the person who's made the mean tweet about transgenders. This is how insane things are at the moment, and so it's so bad that the fantasy world that's being created actually has the full force of the state and law enforcement and all the organs of the state backing it up and forcing it upon us. And you disagree, and you can go to prison. And if you disagree that the 2020 election was all clean and fair and could withstand any rigorous audit, if you've got concerns about that, and you go to the Capitol to express your concerns as a citizen in a so-called democracy, they can put you in prison for that, for goodness sakes. This is again how far if you disagree with certain other things, banks and various other private sector players can make sure you don't have any, you can't get a job, make sure your bank account's closed, and on it goes. So we're living now where the fantasy and reality, or the fantasy is being imposed on any reality, and the reality is required at the point of a gun to give way to the fantasy. Now, I don't know a time this has ever happened. And we know it's a fantasy. We know it's insane, it's crazy. But a lot of the young kids coming through college and high school, they're believing this fantasy that's being forced on them. Critical race theory is an exercise in forcing a fantasy world and a fantasy past, an imaginary world onto particularly white, but also other students in school and in college. So this divide between fantasy and reality is something it's kind of merged, I think, and talking to particularly younger people, students, or even people sort of under the age of 35, say they don't know the difference between the fantasy and reality anymore. They can tell you with a straight face, with indignation, righteous indignation about terrible things that white people have done, but it's all lies. It's pure fantasy. They don't know any of the bad things that other groups of people have done and don't want to know. So this concept of fantasy has changed, and it's being used to crush and humiliate and grind white people down. We know it's fantasy, we know it's untrue, we know it's a pack of lies, but we're being forced at the point of a gun to accept it or to be depersoned from social media and so on. I think this is one of the big challenges we have today: how to bring the younger people and the children back from the fantasy world that's being pushed and forced on them back to the world of reality. And if we head into a world of universal basic income, and where all the property's owned by the big banks, and you're allocated a room or something like that, and you're allocated a food allowance and so on, then the very reality or the very nature of fantasy and reality will itself alter again to reflect a situation where people don't take responsibility, don't need to take responsibility. They just have to think the right thoughts. Otherwise, they may be taken out the back and shot or got rid of somehow, or depersoned in these dystopian future movies where you put outside the city walls and there's these creatures that eat everyone that's put out here. I wonder if we're heading for something like that, given the nature of the dystopia, where fantasy is the reality and is being forced on us as to accept that fantasy is reality. There was an element of this in George Orwell's 1984, where the people in this dystopia were forced to accept whatever the party told them, and if they saw three objects on the ground and the party said there were 6 objects on the ground, then that was it. There were 6. And if you didn't like it, you could be in all sorts of trouble, and you could be the subject of hate and ridicule and shaming and so on. So I think that's where we're at now, but that's my take on things. Put your comments below, and let's have some more debate on this. And I may do a follow-up on this vid later. You've been with Tastas today, and thank you for listening.